I mean, it's to the point where you can't believe anything on the news. Nothing can you believe on the mainstream media. Not a thing. And we've known this, but now the Smith month, I can't remember exactly what it was, but the act that they passed, I believe during Obama's era, where they made it legal, perfectly legal for the American government to openly use propaganda for the betterment of society, for the whole of the nation, right? You know, we're going to lie to you for your own good. It's for your own good that we lie to you and we mislead you and we use propaganda. The Smith-Mundt Act. The U.S. Information and Educational Exchange Act of 1948. So basically there was the Smith-Mundt Act, and this was pulled back. This was disregarded or basically ended, I believe. Let me read it. The Smith-Mundt Act is the basic legislative authorization for propaganda activities conducted by the U.S. Department of State, sometimes called public diplomacy. The act was first introduced by Congressman Carl E. Mundt in January 1945 in the 79th Congress. It was subsequently passed by 80th Congress, signed into law by President Harry S. Truman. The Smith-Mundt Modernization Act of 2012, which was contained within the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2013, is the one I'm talking about, amended the United States Information and Educational Exchange Act of 1948 and the Foreign Relations Authorization Act of 1987, allowing for materials produced by the State Department and the Broadcasting Board of Governors to be available within the United States. So basically what we have here is we have situation where the United States government can openly lie, legally lie to its public through propaganda. The original legislation authorizes the U.S. State Department to communicate to audiences outside of the borders of the United States through broadcasting, face-to-face contacts, exchanges, including educational, cultural, and technical, right? Because that's exactly what we're being hit with today, or being controlled through, which is education, cultural, media culture, mainly popular culture, and technical mainly through social media. Smart technology. Smart technology has brought us to social media, which shapes the culture. It all works together. See the same thing in the schools. The same propaganda is being sold. The publishing of books, people don't read those very often anymore, but it's still a lot of propaganda through books. Okay, especially the ones that are being promoted, like what we see in Oprah's book club and all of this stuff. Magazines, of course, and other media of communication and engagement. Funding for these activities comes from other legislation passed by the U.S. Congress called appropriations. I won't read through the whole thing because I don't want to bore you or waste time, but I just want to give you guys evidence of this ability for the United States to use propaganda. Popularly called the Smith-Mundt Act is the basic legislative authorization for propaganda activities conducted by the U.S. Department of State, sometimes called public diplomacy. All right, so this is their legal right to lie to you. And of course we understand there's the whole background of Project Mockingbird, or Operation Mockingbird, where the CIA is directly connected with the mainstream media news, and they are able to, through the news, produce different forms of propaganda that shapes perspective. Okay? Manufacturing consent. That's exactly what we're dealing with here, and that's how wars are sold, and that's how this whole fear propaganda crisis is being sold. It's the exact same thing. In fact, it seems war is no longer important, especially in a technological age, and all of the old theorists and philosophers speak on this. There's going to come a time, especially Bertrand Russell, Oswald Spengler's discussed this in Man and Technics. He made it very clear that eventually war is not going to be important. You know, Hobbes was big on war, and you know, man is the beast of war, and Spengler would make some of these arguments as well. The idea of man is really a beast. He is a thinking animal, and he will always resort to the common denominator of war, of strife, of conflict. This kind of leads to the might is right. This leads to the will to power of Nietzsche. It's all kind of the same thing. Basically, our last-ditch effort should be to use force. And through war, we accomplish security, safety, and life. Survival, right? Survival of the fittest, Darwinism. All of these things relate. You know, I guess they could be rooted in a materialist perspective. You know, that of the naturalist. Everything is natural from nature. Everything is biological almost be like behaviorism could play a role in this as well. And of course, atheism is a big part of this. And as you can tell here, all of this is anti-Christian, of course, anti-anything creationist, man-focused, man-centered, anti-God, man as God, man as the true force and power in the world. And that's exactly what we're dealing with now. Except now the war is no longer necessarily needed in that sense of brute force. There's a different type of force now. Instead of brute force, or instead of force in itself, it seems to be the case that there's this movement of persuasion, nudging. Instead of forcing us through physical means, they force us through psychological, or I like to call it psycho-spiritual influence, psycho-spiritual persuasion, psycho-spiritual manipulation. Mainly meaning through the confusion of our minds, through manipulating our minds, which is the psychological component, they guide or should I say, they drive our spiritual map, our spiritual condition, whatever spiritual condition one is in. And clearly, if we're going to consider all of these different forms of this materialist worldview that I've just explained here, we understand that would mean the majority of people who do hold that kind of materialist worldview makes right this idea of survival of the fittest, biological perspective, a Darwinian, social Darwinist perspective. With that, we would understand that they would have this worldview and therefore be easily persuaded spiritually, because they're not in the Holy Spirit, of course, they're in the flesh. Right, so their spirits can be easily corrupted and influenced and persuaded, and that's the form of manipulation today through propaganda, is this type of psycho-spiritual persuasion. And I believe that has a lot to do with why people are so easily manipulated today. This seems to be the case. It is not difficult for people to be moved today because, we've discussed this before, they don't really believe in anything. And with that being said, we get to this idea of technological psycho-spiritual persuasion through social media, through media propaganda, mainstream media. And that's why we're seeing this just gross misrepresentation of what this illness truly is. And as I was saying before, different places are addressing it in different ways. So certain cities, mainly the more urbanized cities, the highly populated cities, where the mainstream popular culture tends to be predominant, there you will see more of a hyper reaction to this. There you will see people literally wearing hazmat suits, full-on goggles and masks and gloves. It's getting ridiculous in some of these areas. And this is where you also will see people snitching on others, calling authorities, the whole quarantine shaming, right? Screaming from windows and rooftops, telling people to go home, flatten the curve, save society, save life, go home, save lives, stay inside, save lives. And I made this clear on the last show, they're not worried about saving lives. We let 6 million lives just disappear a year based on our irresponsibility regarding certain substances like alcohol. And we didn't even discuss cigarettes, tobacco, and other types of... We didn't even touch on analgesics, pain relief pills, opiates. We were voluntarily and in fact promoting death on a daily basis in this country. So anyone that wants to talk about save a life is extremely ignorant. They're not paying attention to things. And that's why I talked about perspective. It's about perspective, right? Yeah, it just really depends on what your perspective is. Because in most cases, especially regarding the situation, you're only looking at one thing, and that is anything regarding COVID. You're not actually looking at lives. If lives are to be saved, there's many other things we just blatantly ignore, which is madness to me. But anyhow, so you get these different areas that are addressing this. You have other obscure areas, more rural areas that are less populated, areas that are less in tune with popular culture, kind of do more things in the real world, maybe read a little more, maybe spend a little more time outside, or they may spend a lot of time inside, but they're actually doing things, they're creating things. They're utilizing their time physically and mentally outside of media, outside of popular culture media for sure, and definitely outside of social media. And in these areas, you're going to find a lack of this type of hyper-reactive behavior. You're not going to see everyone practicing social distancing in this gross way. You're not going to see people, snitching on others. There's less of an awareness, and I wouldn't say that's a bad thing. you know, and again, I will repeat it, we should be definitely considering those that are in more of in the path of this illness, right? Those in certain ages, those with compromised immune systems, these types of people, of course. But the general public, man, I think really needs to just continue to live their life, because if we don't, this entire situation is going to take hold, and it already has. It already has economically. It's slowly happening socially, but more importantly, spiritually, it's going to take hold of the world in a way that will not be recovered ever. People are talking to each other differently now. It's almost like they're speaking to each other as if, you know, if this was a pre-corona era, it would almost appear as if they knew their breath stunk or something like that. They're like afraid to enunciate. They're afraid to speak up, and they're kind of almost speaking timidly under their breath. You know, it's this weird, like, oh no, I can't allow oxygen to come from my mouth, and it's not because my breath stinks. It's because I possibly could have coronavirus. I possibly could be asymptomatic, and I don't want to get you or anyone else sick. And I would suggest you do the same, because I don't want to get sick from you. It's this hyper awareness of illness. And what it's doing is breeding paranoia to where we can't even associate and communicate anymore without having this preconceived notion of possible death just based on our breath. You know, the air that we're breathing could be tainted. You know, man, it's just, I know I'm rambling here, but I have so much on my mind. It's sad because I see what's happening, and the effects aren't worth the cause.